The skies over Europe were dark with smoke, the distant thunder of artillery echoing like the drums of an ancient ritual. Soldiers trudged through mud, their uniforms soaked, faces streaked with grime and fatigue. Amid the chaos of World War II, there were tales that the history books chose to bury, stories that even the most seasoned generals rarely admitted aloud. One of these stories belonged to a unit known only in whispers, feared even by the Allies themselves, the Apaches. The name Apache was whispered with a mixture of awe and terror. Not a conventional military regiment, they were not bound by the codes of honor that many claimed guided the armies of the free world. They were shadows, moving silently through villages, forests, and bombed-out towns, leaving devastation in their wake. Their reputation was one of cold, calculated brutality, a reputation that, at the time, was too disturbing to document fully. Yet, the few who survived their encounters spoke of horrors that blurred the line between war and savagery. The origins of the Apaches were as enigmatic as their methods. Drawn from the underworld of Europe's criminal networks, from men who had survived prison cells, gang wars, and the ruthless streets of Paris and Marseille, they were recruited with promises of power, survival, and pay. The war provided the perfect stage for their talents, a world already unhinged by conflict, where morality was a fragile veneer easily stripped away. They learned quickly that obedience to orders was less important than effectiveness, and in the unforgiving crucible of war, the Apaches thrived. By 1943, Europe had become a landscape of terror. Cities lay in ruins, their cobblestone streets cracked, buildings hollowed out by bombs, and the stench of smoke and decay filled the air. It was in this environment that the Apaches perfected their craft. They were often tasked with missions too brutal or morally ambiguous for ordinary soldiers. Interrogations that left no witnesses, sabotage that burned entire neighborhoods, and executions carried out in ways designed to terrorize both enemy and civilian alike. Eyewitnesses described their methods with a trembling voice. In one small French village, a single Apache unit descended after midnight. They moved silently, shadows among shadows. Doors were broken down, and any resistance was met with immediate and lethal force. Families huddled in fear, their cries swallowed by the night. By dawn, the village had been stripped bare, not just of resources, but of its sense of security, its very soul. No one dared speak of what happened, yet rumors spread quickly, like fire across dry grass. What made the Apaches truly terrifying was their unpredictability. Unlike conventional soldiers, who followed chain of command and rules of engagement, the Apaches seemed guided by instinct. Their cruelty was methodical, yet it carried a chaotic edge, a reminder that beneath their discipline lay something untamed, something that history struggled to categorize. There were stories of entire patrols vanishing without a trace, only to be found days later in landscapes altered beyond recognition, bodies mutilated in ways that suggested not just combat, but a ritualistic intent to terrify. Allied intelligence records, now partially declassified, hint at the psychological impact these units had. Even seasoned officers admitted to sleepless nights, haunted by reports of what had transpired in occupied territories. The Apaches were not just a physical threat, they were a weapon of fear, designed to destabilize, to break morale, to turn hope into despair. And yet, very few details were ever recorded officially. The war needed heroes, medals, and victories, not units that reminded the world of humanity's darkest capacities. Their operations were often surgical in precision. One account details a night raid near a strategic supply route. The Apache squad infiltrated silently, disabling vehicles, eliminating guards, and vanishing into the shadows before reinforcements could arrive. Survivors later spoke of a strange ritualistic aspect to their methods. The way they left no trace of their presence, the chilling messages they sometimes carved into walls, a psychological warfare that transcended ordinary combat. Every move was calculated to haunt, to linger in the memory of those who witnessed it. Yet, it was not only the enemy who suffered. Civilians were often caught in the crossfire, and the Apaches seemed indifferent. They were guided by objectives, but these objectives were often entwined with personal vendettas, revenge, or the twisted amusement of their leaders. Letters intercepted by Allied intelligence hinted at a disturbing sense of pride in their effectiveness, a pride rooted not in valor, but in fear inflicted. Those who resisted, those who spoke too freely, vanished. Names were erased, families displaced, and entire communities were left to whisper of atrocities that could never fully be proven. Despite their notoriety, the Apaches were a mystery. Allied soldiers referred to them only in hushed tones, often calling them ghosts or shadows. Their true numbers were unknown, their origin stories inconsistent, yet the fear they instilled was universally acknowledged. They operated in sectors where conventional warfare seemed almost irrelevant, where ordinary tactics failed, and the presence of the Apaches alone could alter the course of an engagement. What made them particularly insidious was their ability to blend in. The Apaches could wear the uniform of their enemies, speak the language of the locals, and vanish into crowds. Resistance fighters who thought themselves secure found that betrayal could come from any direction. Friendships, alliances, and even familial bonds offered no protection. The Apaches redefined the rules of engagement, introducing a moral ambiguity that left survivors questioning not only their actions but their own humanity. By late 1944, as the Allies pushed deeper into occupied Europe, the trail of the Apaches became harder to follow. Their operations left scars on towns, forests, and memory itself. Some units were eventually cornered, others disappeared entirely, leaving behind only fragmented accounts of what had occurred. Historians piecing together post-war records discovered patterns of brutality so extreme that entire chapters of the war's history were quietly edited, sanitized, or omitted. It was as if the very fabric of fear these men had woven had to be erased from public consciousness. And yet, the stories persisted. In letters, diaries, and whispered recollections, the shadow of the Apaches remained. Children spoke of nights when strangers moved silently in the streets. Soldiers carried nightmares into the trenches, haunted by figures who could not be captured or comprehended. The war had revealed the edge of human cruelty, and the Apaches had sharpened it to a terrifying point. To this day, many of the details about the Apaches' actions remain classified or lost. The full scope of their brutality may never be known. But what is undeniable is their influence on both strategy and psyche. They introduced a new form of warfare, where terror itself was weaponized, where the boundaries between combatant and civilian blurred, and where the very concept of morality in war was challenged. As the Allies celebrated victories, liberated cities, and tallied the cost of war, the Apaches faded into the shadows of history. Their deeds were neither lauded nor fully condemned. They simply existed, a testament to the darkness that can emerge when chaos and human ingenuity intersect. Even now, in the quiet corners of Europe, stories of their actions linger. In crumbling villages, in forgotten forests, in diaries hidden in attics, the memory of the Apaches whispers to those who dare to listen that the truth of war is far more brutal than any textbook will admit, and that sometimes the shadows hold more terror than the light. As the winter of 1944 crept across Europe, a bitter chill gripped the liberated towns, but the fear of the Apaches burned hotter than any frost. Their presence lingered, unseen yet undeniable, a phantom imprint on shattered streets and broken lives. Even after Allied forces reclaimed villages, reports emerged of the same horrors repeating in pockets where the Apaches had once struck. It was as if the war had merely provided them a stage to perform a terrifying symphony of destruction and psychological warfare. By this point in the war, resistance movements and Allied command understood the pattern. The Apaches thrived in chaos, feeding on fear, exploiting disorder. Their operations became more audacious as the Axis power faltered, and Allied officers struggled to track them. Intelligence units described the difficulty of anticipating the Apaches' next move. Unlike conventional forces, they were not bound by strategy or supply lines. Their goals were fluid, often cruelly inventive, designed to destabilize and dismantle in ways no military doctrine had prepared for. One account details a night in northern France where an Apache squad infiltrated a village that had been briefly liberated by French resistance fighters. The villagers had dared to celebrate their freedom, the first sign of normalcy in months. By midnight, that celebration turned into a nightmare. Witnesses later described shadows moving through houses, the soft hiss of suppressed weapons, and the deliberate destruction of anything that symbolized hope. Survivors spoke of a meticulous cruelty, bread torn apart and thrown into mud, livestock slaughtered not for food but for fear, letters and photographs burned, erasing both memory and identity. It wasn't just the physical devastation that defined the Apaches. It was the psychological imprint. Children awoke screaming. Adults wandered through towns paralyzed by paranoia, unsure who to trust. The Apaches sometimes masqueraded as Allied soldiers, or even locals, leaving no signature of their presence except the echo of dread. Allied patrols would arrive too late to find evidence, encountering only silent streets, abandoned homes, and the aftermath of terror. The leaders of these units were as enigmatic as their tactics. Some historians suggest that their commanders were former criminals, men who had risen through the underworld before being absorbed into the machinery of war. They were strategic yet sadistic, understanding that war was as much about breaking spirits as it was about breaking armies. Orders were delivered with chilling simplicity. Instill fear, complete the mission, leave nothing behind but the memory of horror. Loyalty was to the squad and to survival, not to nations or codes of conduct. In one particularly harrowing operation, the Apaches were tasked with disrupting a supply convoy in Belgium. Allied intelligence expected a simple raid, yet the execution was far beyond normal expectations. Vehicles were disabled in calculated chaos, soldiers captured and released hours later, shaken and confused. Messages were scrawled in mud and dust, cryptic, threatening, yet devoid of signature. By the time reinforcements arrived, the Apache unit had vanished, leaving a trail of uncertainty and terror that spread faster than the bullets they fired. The Apaches' methods were often theatrical, bordering on ritualistic. Interrogations were conducted in abandoned churches, town square, and bombed factories, chosen for the psychological impact as much as tactical advantage. Survivors recounted scenes that blurred the lines between fear, survival, and horror. Captives forced to witness destruction, messages written in blood, silence maintained through dread rather than physical restraint. It was calculated, deliberate, and designed to linger far beyond the immediate moment. Yet, paradoxically, the Apaches sometimes showed restraint in ways that made their cruelty even more unnerving. Select individuals were spared, only to become unwitting messengers of terror, carrying tales that ensured the next targets would anticipate horror before it arrived. This psychological manipulation was as effective as any weapon. Fear traveled faster than reinforcements, and even the bravest soldiers found themselves hesitant to act, anticipating shadows that might not exist. As Allied forces pressed into Germany, the Apache units became ghost-like figures, slipping behind lines, leaving chaos in their wake. Their presence was a constant reminder that war was not merely fought with bullets and bombs, but with the human mind as its battlefield. Entire towns were abandoned in anticipation of their arrival. Military planners struggled to counter an enemy who refused conventional engagement. The Apaches had transformed warfare into an experience of uncertainty, unpredictability, and terror. Some survivors of Apache operations later described encounters that defied simple explanation. Men would vanish from camps overnight, only to be found days later miles away, unharmed but visibly shaken, their expressions empty. Families would disappear in the dead of night, only for traces of their presence to be discovered weeks later in haunting tableaus, arrangements of personal belongings that spoke of observation, control, and fear. No pattern was predictable, no action safe, and the effect on morale was profound. By the spring of 1945, the end of the war approached, but the shadow of the Apaches persisted. Allied forces discovered isolated units still operational, conducting raids in abandoned sectors, as if unaware that the larger conflict was nearing its conclusion. Accounts from towns liberated in this final stretch describe a surreal scene. Soldiers and civilians cautiously emerging from hiding, only to find that the Apaches had anticipated every move, leaving behind meticulous reminders of their presence, designed to haunt even in peace. Post-war investigations struggled to reconcile the Apaches' actions with military records. Reports were fragmented, often contradictory, and in some cases deliberately omitted. There was an unspoken agreement among historians, intelligence officers, and military leaders. Some truths of the war were too dark to record fully. The Apaches represented that darkness, a convergence of human ingenuity, ruthlessness, and psychological warfare that defied easy categorization. Today, decades later, the full story of the Apaches remains obscured. Survivors' testimonies, rarely cited in mainstream histories, reveal a unit whose impact transcended conventional military engagement. They redefined fear, leaving psychological scars that lingered long after the physical wounds of war healed. The Apaches were a reminder that within the machinery of organized combat, there exists a capacity for calculated terror that challenges not only strategies, but morality itself. In modern accounts, their actions are sometimes dismissed as anomalies, extreme outliers in an already brutal war. Yet when piecing together diaries, letters, and fragments of intelligence reports, a chilling pattern emerges. The Apaches were not merely violent. They were architects of psychological devastation. Every mission, every raid, every ghostly disappearance served a dual purpose: to achieve tactical objectives and to imprint terror upon the human mind, ensuring that their presence would be felt far longer than the war itself. Some historians argue that the Apaches' legacy influenced the methods of post-war special operations units. The principles of fear, deception, and psychological manipulation, honed in the chaos of Europe, informed strategies and conflicts that followed. Yet the Apaches themselves faded from official recognition, existing only in fragments, whispers, and the quiet recollections of those who had survived encounters with them. The story of the Apaches is a reminder of the complexities of war. While battles are recorded in statistics and victories, the true cost often remains hidden in shadows. Fear, terror, and psychological warfare are as potent as any bomb, shaping human behavior, influencing decisions, and leaving scars that persist across generations. The Apaches exemplified this truth, demonstrating that some of the most profound weapons of war are invisible, yet devastatingly effective. Even now, the remnants of their deeds can be traced in abandoned villages, in hushed stories passed down through families, and in the lingering awareness among military historians that not all acts of valor and cruelty are properly documented. The Apaches operated in the shadows, and while history has attempted to erase or sanitize their actions, the echoes remain, a testament to the darkest potentials of humanity, sharpened by war and executed with terrifying precision. The war ended, nations rebuilt, and yet the specter of the Apaches continued to haunt those who survived. Their story, hidden from textbooks, reminds us that sometimes the most powerful truths of history are not the victories celebrated in public squares, but the shadows that linger quietly, shaping memory, fear, and the understanding of what humanity is capable of when the rules of morality are suspended. In the end, the Apaches were never just soldiers. They were a phenomenon, a force of terror that history tried to forget. Their legacy challenges us to confront the uncomfortable reality that in war, darkness can become an instrument, and that sometimes the stories we are least willing to tell are the ones that reveal the most about ourselves.